Hi everyone, Steve here, and I just want to say a few things about The Innocents. This is a Jack Clayton film made in 1961. I won't really talk about it at length in this lecture or even sort of covering it this week, but something I do kind of want to bring your attention to of this and many of the other readings in this course is that what we're actually looking at are old readings adapted to new cultural contexts. And The Innocents is an adaptation of Turn of the Screw, which is Henry James, which was written originally in 1898. And The Innocents is actually a contemporary sort of updating of that film. Now, The Innocents today may seem like a sort of an old and a dated film because it's 1961. Um, but at the time, it was really updating an old work. And kind of think about that when you're watching this film, how it is sort of updating the older work and what it's actually doing to sort of connect with contemporary audiences. This is also a film that sort of it sits within kind of the Hammer horror genre, which is that kind of B grade schlock kind of haunted house horror. The Innocents isn't like that at all, and I don't really think it's a horror. I mean, it's not really fair to say it's a horror. It's a very sort of chilling, eerie sort of film, but it's certainly not a horror. So it's also it's important to think about it sort of sitting within that cycle, but also doing some other things sort of outside that cycle. Okay, so the Tennis Screw is a novella, and I'm really interested in different forms of prose writing being adapted into the feature film format. And the novella is important to just sort of clarify what the novella is and what the novella does. Now, a lot of people, a lot of novelists will say, oh, the novella isn't really any different to the novel. Um, I think there is quite a difference to the novel and the novella. The novella is essentially a short novel. It would be about 100, it could be anywhere really between 80 and 150 pages. And so that's what the novella is. Now, there's a strong resemblance between the screenplay and the novella, and a lot of people who have adapted novellas into screenplays have actually said it's the perfect form. It's the form that suits the feature film screenplay better than any other form. Both are around the same word length. They're around 20,000 words. Right, so there's something going on there with both. Both have room for subplots, but kind of two at a stretch. The problem with a novel is sort of endless. I mean, a novel can be 1,000 pages, it can be 200 pages. So there's sort of no room to sort of stop, what's actually going on with the plot of a novel. You can just kind of keep writing the novel forever, really. And then, yeah, of course, you can kind of do sequels and things like that. The novella is a far more disciplined form of writing, as is the screenplay. And that's why the two also share a great similarity. And a lot of people who have written screenplays have written novellas as well and actually prefer the novellas. Truman Capote being a good example of that, Breakfast at Tiffany's being his famous novella. And Capote actually worked on the screenplay for this film. So that's kind of interesting that here is an expert on the novella actually writing a sort of working with the adaptation. Now, what the screenplay and the novella both have also is the characters are established through minimal explanation, but they're ambiguous enough to be kind of fleshed out. So what I'm wanting you to do is when you're reading the novella and you're watching the film, kind of think about what other changes have actually happened. And the difference with a novel, the problem with a novel is you actually have to strip things away from the novel. But with a novella, you don't. You can actually take everything that's in the novella and put it on the screen. And you don't have to include a lot more, which is different again to the short story. Now, the connection with film and the novella is the element of performance, right? So often what you have in the novella, you're kind of limited with time with both forms, right? With the screenplay or with the novella. So what you actually have is a character often saying, I'll tell you the story, this is what went down a little while ago. So they're telling a story in flashback, and it can often be a first person perspective of that, where they're actually kind of rehashing an old story. There's something of a campfire tale going on with the novella, whether it's people sitting around talking about a story that actually happened. And the kind of the film sort of has that similar idea as well. What you actually get with the novella and the film is the idea that you're going to sit down and get through it in one sitting. Now, you may not get through a novella in one sitting, but that's kind of the idea. And the speed and the pace is actually very quick for you to digest it in one sitting. So think about that also when you're reading it. Is this a novella that actually wants to be read in one sitting, as opposed to a novel, which is really paced through particular chapters, which is with the idea that you're going to be putting a novel down and picking it up again. Now, what you actually get with a lot of pulp noir novels also is a heavy use of voiceover, and we get that with novellas with sort of the first person perspective. Not so much in this one, but even though we sort of do get the first person perspective. But certainly with a lot of those kind of pulpy noir novels. I'm not sure if you've read them, but it's kind of interesting comparison also. Now, Deborah Kerr. So Deborah Kerr, you're probably thinking, who is Deborah Kerr? Well, Deborah Kerr was this big star in sort of the 1950s and the 1960s. I was sort of thinking, who is the comparison to Deborah Kerr today? And it's probably someone like Nicole Kidman. Now, there's a reason why you would think Nicole Kidman, because The Innocents was actually updated again, and it was called The Others. And The Others actually starred Nicole Kidman, and she was cast because a lot of people kind of thought that she's sort of a modern version of Deborah Kerr. Deborah Kerr was a big star at the time of The Innocents, right? And she's about 40 years of age. Now, what's interesting about her casting is she wasn't actually the timid woman of James's novella, right? She, like there's a bit in the novella where she's flinching at the grim prospect of serious duties and little company. This is a line sort of given to someone who's quite immature and doesn't actually want to do duties herself or housework herself, or sort of take responsibility herself. What we get with Deborah Kerr is a lady who's much older, a lady who is 40, and she looks like she's a lady of experience, and she looks like a responsible lady. So it kind of goes against that idea of James's character. I don't know if that's interesting to sort of really talk about, or if you actually don't have a problem with that at all. Now, does the gravitas of the role require a big and capable star? And that's sort of what I would put to you. If you think that Deborah Kerr maybe is not the right person for this because she's a bit older, it's such a dominant role, and you need such a dominant sort of actor to be able to handle that particular role. Just one other question I just want to put to you is, who would you cast in a remake of this film? So if you're going to make the film right now, today, who would you cast? Would it be Nicole Kidman, or have we kind of moved on from Nicole Kidman? If you're going to cast a younger actress, an actress sort of the age of James's novella, who would you cast? So I just want to talk through some of Thomas Leitch's modes as they apply to this film. So I would say that the film is a celebration. There's certainly a celebration being a heavy reluctance to change the exact words or sentiment of the source. So in prose, we're being told or read a story by one author. Right? That's the whole idea with a novella, or a novel, or a short story, any sort of prose. That you're actually being told a story. You're being read a story, essentially. Right? Now, what we actually have when there's words on a piece of paper is there's greater opportunities for miscommunication or misinterpretation, right? And this is why we have book clubs and things like that, because it's what everyone's reading. People are reading the same passage, but they're reading it very differently, right? And it's because wordplay can really play around with that. I would say a lot cleaner than, say, the screen. The thing about the screen, and a lot of critics will say this, Thomas Leitch will say this, John Flaus will say this, what we're seeing on the screen is truth, because we're seeing it, and we've been led to believe that what we see is true, because if what we were seeing isn't true, then we must be completely bonkers, all right? So what we see is true. So if we want evidence that something is truthful, we want to see like photographic or moving picture evidence of what is actually going on. Right. Now, film often only wants to give you sort of one reading and one answer. Film is very simple, right? Film is actually saying, I want you to think this at this time, generally, right? That's the whole point of the close-up. It doesn't actually give you room to actually think outside the close-up, right? But not all directors want to kind of play by this rule that, film is giving you a very clear-cut, idea of actually what's going on. Some people, like Jack Clayton, who directed this, right, they want to give you sort of a more ambiguous idea of what's going on. David Lynch is very famous for doing this, that, you don't actually get a categorical answer to anything that's going on the screen. It's really there for interpretation. Now, a lot of filmgoers have frustration with this because when you go to the movies, you're sort of told a story, you're given reasons for it, and you're given answers, and everything is sort of resolved by the end. Now, in the Turn of the Screw, we don't really get that. Everything is quite ambiguous, and that's because, again, it's prose, and he's sort of playing around with the whole idea of interpret it how you want to interpret it, but I'm not going to show you anything, and you don't have to show when it's words on paper. With The Innocents, right, there's a great ambiguity. So what Jack Clayton's doing is he's questioning Mrs. Giddens as a reliable narrator. That's Deborah Kerr, right? So what happens with this, instead of just showing you how it really is going down, what he's doing is he's showing you the film through Miss Giddens' point of view, but the characters are questioning her sanity all the time. And she's questioning her own sanity all the time, right? So the whole question about the film is this a hallucination, right? So is it all just happening in her mind? Or are these things and these people apparitions, like they're actually happening outside her mind? Are the ghosts actually real? Now, the thing about Jack Clayton, what he's doing is he's kind of saying yes to both. Yes, they're a hallucination from her mind, and yes, they're an apparition from her mind. And it becomes very frustrating as a viewer because you're like, well, are these ghosts real or aren't they real? What's actually going on? And he never gives you that categorical answer because what he's wanting to do is really celebrate what's going on in the novella and what made Henry James's novella so eerie and so creepy that you're never given categorical answers to anything. Now, the film is certainly a secondary adaptation as well, and it's part of this broader cycle. And the broader cycle is this horror cycle of psychological horror of females in a domestic space without a male presence, right? And this goes back way beyond The Innocents. Like it's there in Turn of the Screw. It's there in all the Hammer horrors. It's also there in a film like The Babadook, and it's really interesting if you actually look at publicity posters of both films. Deborah Kerr looks pretty much. I mean, you look at the look on Amelia's face from The Babadook, and it's pretty much the same look and what's going on. And the whole idea is that you've got these figures, these female figures inside a house, and things are going on, and there's no male to sort of fend off evil. So evil is infiltrating itself into the house and what's actually going on there. And the whole question about these films is the horror and is the evil happening inside these mad women's heads, or is it actually truthful? Now, what you actually get in a lot of these films, it is truthful, and it's not, crazy woman look out kind of film. It is really about that evil is coming in. So you've got it in The Babadook, you've got it in Innocence. You've also got it in something like Rosemary's Baby. Rosemary's the whole thing about Rosemary's Baby is she's paranoid that that Satan is basically growing inside her, and then she realizes that yes, she's has great reason to believe that everybody is conspiring against her. But it's kind of interesting, and the thing about The Babadook today is we don't sort of really question it, but the thing about The Innocents then is the fact that you've got Deborah Kerr, so you've got a female as the lead in a film in 1961, which was actually quite rare. You've got this evil thing happening, and she's actually standing up to it. And you don't actually see that a lot in films, where you've got a female standing up to it without the presence of a male standing by her side, or the presence of a male doing kind of the dirty work. So what you actually have to do with The Innocents, you have to place it within this broader spectrum, or this broader cycle, or broader genre, if you want to call it that, of what's actually going on with these domestic psychological horrors, right, where they're absent of men. And what's really interesting about these two publicity posters is there are no men on the posters, right? And it's still today, it's a big deal. If you hear the filmmakers of a film like The Dressmaker, what they were actually saying is they had found it very hard to get a film funded because they didn't have, until they had a strong male lead. Now, something like The Babadook, something like The Innocents, it never actually gives you that strong male lead, which is really fascinating and really sort of progressive. But The Innocents, certainly, it's not a sort of a film that kind of sits in a standalone way. It actually sits within this broader cycle. Okay, so it's also an adjustment adaptation. Adjustment is changes and alters the source without losing the sentiment, Right, so it changes the source without losing the sentiment of the source. So what the film does is it follows the novella until Miss Jezzel's disappearance. So it does actually add some things. So what happens is it follows the novella, right, and then Miss Jezzel disappears. And then what it does, it introduces a new sequence which doesn't appear in the novella. And this is Miss Giddens. She notices a teardrop on the slate on the teacher's dress, right? She looks at it, she touches it, and then she realizes that the tears are real. Now, if the tears are real, the ghost must also be real. Yeah? So what's happening up to this point is it's Miss Giddens is nuts, Miss Giddens is bonkers, it's all happening inside her head, crazy, 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 look out everyone. And then what Jack Clayton does is he says, but hang on, there is a tear from the somewhat ghost, and it's real. So what's going on with that? Now, is this all just happening in Miss Giddens' head, and is she actually believing there's a tear there and the tear isn't really there? Well, that's another question. But it's really interesting what he's doing. He's never, as soon as you start to think, okay, this is a hallucination inside her head, he actually then gives you some evidence to say, oh, no, it's not just inside her head. He keeps playing around with that whole idea. Is that frustrating for you as a viewer? That you're not given a categorical answer to, are these ghosts actually real? Which is also, very much in really within the novella of what Henry James is doing. So he makes adjustments to sort of support what Henry James is doing. Now, analogy, these are often inspired by, based on adaptations. They're not literal adaptations of the text, right? Now, if you actually think of Jane Eyre and The Innocents, or Turn of the Screw, there's a lot of similarity actually going on. So in Jane Eyre, you've got a young, inexperienced governess who's sent to a mysterious and rather creepy house. Sound familiar? Okay. So Jane meets the master of the house, she falls in love with him. And once she sort of meets him on equal footing, she marries him. All right? Okay. So then in the Turn of the Screw, governess, right? She goes to a creepy house. She falls in love with the master of the house, right? Although she doesn't really acknowledge that, even to herself. And once in the house, she finds another male presence, a very dominating male presence, and possibly a substitute for the master who isn't there, right? This presence is Peter Quint, right? But the thing about Peter Quint is he's dead, right? So it's sort of like, is it kind of, you can't really say it's parody because it doesn't actually want you to laugh at Jane Eyre, and it's not pastiche because it's not directly wanting you to think of Jane Eyre. It's just the whole idea of it is there. So that's why I'd sort of say analogy. And it's really just, you could say it's inspired by, the structure or the story of Jane Eyre, but it's actually going somewhere else with it. Colonisation also, and I'll sort of finish with just talking about the ending. So colonisation is really the adapter putting their own unique style on the source, right? And Jack Clayton was sort of known for his rather explicit moments in his films, rather explicit endings in his films. And the ending is really interesting with Miles. So in the novella, right, it says the poison of an influence that I dared but half... Oh, sorry. In the novella, so earlier before the ending, right, you've got sort of Deborah Kerr saying these different things. Not Deborah Kerr, Miss Giddens. The poison of an influence that I dared but half froze. Right. Now this makes him appear as accessible as an older person. So she's treating Miles as an older equal. All right. The young boy, she's treating him as an older equal. And she treats him as an intellectual equal. All right. So all these things are being said in the novella. Then we get to the movie. Right. And Miss Giddens, she goes one step further than treating him as an intellectual equal. She kisses him full on the mouth, as one would an adult. And it's quite interesting, and it was quite explicit at the time, and it still sort of seems rather explicit, because it makes you question, okay, what's actually going on here with Miss Giddens and Miles? Now, firstly, the censors tried to stop, and they tried to ban the ending, but Jack Clayton refused, right? Because they said, firstly, she's kissing a young boy full on the mouth, which is a bit gross, and secondly, at the time when she kisses him, he's dead. So, again, a bit gross. But they weren't able to censor it. Jack Clayton refused, and the film went out like that. The thing about it is, has she developed an unnatural affection for Miles? And I reckon, well, who knows? I mean, that's really up to you to decide. But it's a really interesting way of ending the movie and actually what's going on with the movie. Now, what all of this does, the explicit ending, right, is it takes you from the novella. The novella doesn't end in such an explicit way, as you will discover when you read it, right? What the explicit ending does is it puts attention on the director for daring to produce such an ending, right? Because what it's saying is, okay, why did the director decide that? Why did the director go there? Why did the director push it further than that? So it's a colonization as far as the adapter putting their own fingerprints on the source. And that's really what Jack Clayton is doing with this work. Okay, I'll leave it there. I hope you enjoy The Innocents. It's an absolute wonderful film. It really is. To see it on the big screen is truly amazing. Deborah Kerr is phenomenal in it. It's a film that holds up really well today, and with all the try-hard horror that's actually going on, the schlock, big bang horror, this is an absolute wonderful essay on how to make a horror that really isn't a horror, but it's just uncomfortable and it's chilling. And Deborah Kerr is truly, truly mesmerizing. Okay, I'll leave it there and I'll see you at the screening.